Thanks so much for joining the Santa Fe Watershed Association as we explore the important relationships between soil and water within the context of the Santa Fe River watershed.
My name is Aaron Kaufman.
I'm Maury Hensley. Today, we are at Frenchy's Field Park on the Santa Fe River with Aaron to learn about soil structure, infiltration, and the historic management of this and many other agricultural sites throughout Santa Fe through the lens of the 5 healthy soil principles. This site has a shared history with much of the watershed and of northern New Mexico, and is both an example of past circumstances that have led to degradation, as well as a starting point for better soil and water stewardship going into the future. Whether your local soil lies within the boundaries of the Santa Fe River watershed or a different watershed, we hope that some of the concepts and histories we'll be discussing throughout the series will provide you with useful information and inspiration for your own explorations of soil and watershed stewardship.
Farmers and ranchers, gardeners are going to be interested in soil structure in terms of its quality. It's kind of good and bad soil structure. Good soil structure would be soil that maintains a decent amount of organic material, which kind of holds it together. So here you can see some rich organic compost being held in my hands, not falling apart, but it's kind of crumbly. So as you break it apart, you can still see that it's holding together. And basically that crumbly nature is what allows for good water movement and air movement, which plants are going to kind of take advantage of with their roots, but then also because of the organic material, it's going to offer some element of nutrients for plants to grow. Poor soil structure would just be sand. So for example, this is just purely kind of granular. Essentially, I can press it together in my hand as tight as I can. When I open my hand back up, there's nothing really holding it together. It just kind of flows outward. In terms of influencing the hydrology, water would essentially move quickly through this sand, which is great in terms of infiltration, but what it means is that it will dry out much more quickly. So essentially, plants that are growing in this area or trying to grow in this area are going to need more reliable water in order to kind of keep their roots wet. Whereas soil like this, with a high amount of organic material, remains moist for longer periods of time, in addition to having good infiltration similar to that sand. So that's a good indication of good and bad soil structure. So in addition to soil structure, one of the other big soil variables that influences hydrology in the watershed is soil texture. Texture is usually kind of a measure of different soil particles that range in size from clays and silts and sands, which kind of form the soil texture triangle. But texture can also include larger particle sizes, including gravels, cobbles, and even boulders. But for the purposes of kind of discussing agriculture, most of what we're interested in is kind of that soil triangle of those 3 finer particle sizes. One of the things that these textures really influence is how quickly water can move through the soil surface, as well as once it kind of moves beyond that initial surface area, how it moves underground, and sometimes that can be in a downward fashion, and sometimes that can be kind of laterally. When we talk about soil moving through the soil surface, we're typically talking about infiltration, and we can talk about the rate at which it moves through. So infiltration rate is basically just a measure of water movement in terms of depth over time. As, for example, a thunderstorm or some sort of rainstorm is passing through over the area, as it's dropping rain, there's going to be some amount of water that can enter the soil surface before runoff starts to occur. If that intensity of that thunderstorm is really high and the water is falling at a faster rate than the soil can absorb it, we basically reach the maximum rate of infiltration, which we call infiltration capacity, basically the maximum rate the soil can absorb water. Once that water has kind of moved through the soil surface and infiltrated, then we start to talk about percolation, and that's basically the movement of water underground. And again, it can behave differently in terms of moving sideways or downward, depending on different soil textures that exist underneath. And what we'd like to do now is actually kind of run a soil infiltration test, and we'll kind of walk you through that process for something that you can try at home. So in order to conduct a soil infiltration test, you're going to need a few materials. The first is you're going to need some sort of pipe. In this case, traditionally what's used is kind of a metal piece of pipe that's about 6 inches in diameter, and it's about 5 inches long. And what you'll notice is that we're going to drive this pipe into the ground about 2 inches into the soil surface, and then we'll have this remaining 3 inches above the soil surface. In addition to this pipe, you're going to need a timer. You can use a phone. You're going to need a piece of saran wrap. You're going to need, given the size of this pipe, you're going to need 444 milliliters of water. Basically what we're trying to do is simulate a 1-inch storm event that's going to fall inside of this kind of this area of the pipe. In the event that you use a smaller diameter pipe, you're going to need to calculate what the volume of water would be to reach 1 inch inside of there. We're going to also have just a hammer or a mallet and a piece of wood to put over the top of this to be able to drive this pipe into the ground. And then the last thing you'll need is just a pen and a paper to record your results. After you've hammered the pipe into the ground, you'll just want to make sure that there isn't any kind of loose material around the interior edge. If there is, you can just kind of ensure that it's just not compact, but you just want to make sure that there isn't any cracks, because what we don't want is the water to kind of enter and immediately leave out that outside of the pipe. We want this water infiltrating through this soil surface to get an indication of what the infiltration rate is. At this point, what we do is we place a piece of saran wrap into the pipe. And the reason for this is we don't want to pour the water directly into the pipe, because what that does is it actually seals the soil surface. And we're trying to ensure that we're not actually kind of manipulating the soil in a way that it actually infiltrates slower than what it traditionally would. Okay, so we've got our 444 milliliters of water and our saran wrap here. And essentially we're just going to very carefully pour this on top of the saran wrap, and so it's suspended on top of there. The other benefit here is this allows us to get our timer ready before the water starts to infiltrate. So we've got the water in there, we're going to have our timer ready, and then we're just going to very easily pull this away and begin timing. And at this point, depending on the soil texture and infiltration rate, it could take anywhere from a couple of minutes to maybe well over an hour. And typically, what soil scientists will do is they'll run an infiltration test under dry conditions initially, but that's not the best indication of infiltration for a site. It's basically just telling you what it's like under dry conditions, but ideally what you'll do is you'll conduct this test a second time at the same location, and you'll get a better indication of how quickly water moves to the soil surface after the soil has been kind of slightly wetted or become potentially saturated. So you can see we're just about to the end here. You can see that the water is almost completely infiltrated, a little bit of glistening, but there's a tiny bit of water around the edge. We're approaching about 6 minutes, and the soil is almost completely infiltrated. There's a tiny bit along this inner edge. We'll stop the timer at that point, and then we'll conduct the equation necessary to kind of determine what the infiltration rate is here. So that is about where we'll stop. So we had 6 minutes and 13 seconds in terms of the infiltration. What we need to do now is we need to calculate what the estimated inches per hour infiltration rate that we have for this soil type. Basically put an inch storm inside of this pipe and measured the time. It took 6 minutes and 13 seconds, so about 6 1/4 minutes. So in order to calculate this, all we're going to do is we're going to take 1 and we're going to divide it by 6.25, which is the total number of minutes it took. That gives us 0.16, and from there we're going to multiply that times 60, and that gives us 9.6. So basically that is the number of inches per hour that this soil will absorb or infiltrate. Now, as a quick reminder, this was under dry conditions, so to some degree the water's probably moving through that soil surface a little bit quickly. If we were to perform this test again, more than likely it would be a little bit slower, but that would be a better representation of what the infiltration rate is for soils at this site. And the reason this is crucial in hydrology and also for the purposes of managing soils is because that is the point at which water will begin to run across the soil surface. And as that water begins to build up momentum or velocity, it has more energy to erode those soils. So you can actually see behind me here water that's falling off of onto impervious areas such as streets or sidewalks just up adjacent to Frenchy's field. Has no ability to infiltrate, so essentially it reaches its infiltration capacity almost immediately, and it has to run off, and so it's piped into some sort of storm drain, runs off the soil surface, and then it can start to erode. Behind me you can see the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which serves as the origin for the Santa Fe River. We're about halfway down the river's corridor before it empties into the Rio Grande near the confluence with the community of Coche de Pueblo. This particular stretch of the river is unique because there used to be a lot of historic farming through here, including at Frenchy's Park. There is evidence of settlements as much as 800 years ago, which is indicative of the fact that people would have had to have been able to farm to some degree. One of the main factors that allowed for good agricultural practices in this area is probably a high water table and the reliability of the river through this area. There's evidence from when Europeans were beginning to settle the area that this stretch of the river would actually support trout, which is a good indication that the river was reliable in terms of being able to provide irrigation. As the Spanish and other Europeans came into the area, they were digging a lot of irrigation ditches called acequias. One of the main acequias is called the Acequia Madre, and a lateral branch of that irrigation ditch actually ended near Frenchy's field and provided the kind of irrigation that was necessary to support a dairy farm and other kind of farming practices in the vicinity. In addition to the reliability of this water source, agriculture in the area would have been supported by good soils, including good structure and important kind of textural components, which would have allowed for good infiltration and also good water holding capacity, which we'll be talking about here in the area. I'm currently sitting on top of what's called the Tasuki Formation, and this particular soil group is a group of kind of cemented sand. It's got some cobble in it, some gravel, and essentially what it does is it acts as this impermeable layer which the Santa Fe River used to pass on top of. As the water of the river was propped up, it would help recharge the soil layers above this kind of cemented conglomerate. Just above me are the soils that are kind of the more porous soils of Frenchy's field. The benefit of that Tasuki Formation is it would have allowed for water to be stored in this upper soil profile when the Santa Fe River kind of passed over the top of it. So essentially all of this gravel and cobble and this coarse porous material would have been a great place to store water along the kind of the floodplain of the Santa Fe River. Certainly would have allowed for kind of increased water storage to support crops and pasture when this area was historically used for agriculture. One of the benefits of the Natural Resource Conservation Service is they provide some online maps which the public can use to characterize soils in their area. And in the case of Frenchy's field, there are kind of two primary soil horizons or profiles that are unique to this site. One is called the Del Valle Urban Land Complex, and the other one is a Rio Vista gravelly sandy loam. Both soil profiles are kind of indicative of very coarse material, a lot of sand, a lot of gravel, cobble, which means that water can easily infiltrate into the soil surface, but it's not held there very well. It's a great place to store water if you can lift the water table. So you can see here we have kind of this thin A layer, basically a little bit of organic matter from the surface, which is created, which you would consider to be a little bit of topsoil. And as soon as you drop below that, you're starting to see the increase in sands, and down below a lot of the cobble and the gravel layers. One of the concerns with urbanization in this area is that we have much more rapid runoff off of our streets, and it's cut through this material. Even though it's cemented, it's still easy to kind of break apart, and as floods have cut through it, the water table has dropped with it, and we're no longer able to kind of allow the Santa Fe River to access the floodplain, which would have recharged those more porous materials characteristic of Frenchy's field.
As Aaron mentioned earlier, this area has seen many layers of human history over the centuries, each associated with their own management approaches. Due to a variety of factors, however, it appears that between 1933 and 1983, Frenchy's farm was what finally witnessed the end of the high water table and good soil. Increasing population of the city and the expansion of nearby impervious surfaces contributed to the erosion that eventually ate through the Tsuke Formation and dehydrated the upper soil layers. Plowing and overstocking of cattle on the floodplain led to overgrazing, soil compaction, loss of topsoil, and the propagation of non-native plants. To wrap up, here are some key takeaways from this video.
First is that we have a lowered water table. The Santa Fe River has incised or eroded through some of the Tsuke Formation, which means that it no longer has access to its floodplain and it can't recharge those coarse gravels and cobbles textures that are in the floodplain area. Another thing that's kind of diminished here is good soil structure. The overgrazing and the compaction of animals that are kind of tightly knit together has led to kind of a loss of that good topsoil and the ability of those soils to kind of hold water between precipitation events. And the other thing we talked about was texture and how it influences the way in which water can move through the soil surface and how it's held in some of the lower profiles or moves through as percolation. So if you kind of tie those things together, what you start to see here is with the loss of that water table, with the loss of kind of good soil structure, and because of the more coarse soil textures that are here, we tend to have a drier soil profile. And so you can kind of see that reflected in the vegetation that's existing here. You have these annuals that to a large degree just respond to precipitation events, and then some of the efforts that have been made to kind of plant fruit trees or other trees as part of the park have kind of suffered as a result of the drier soil conditions. So you have this apple tree here that even though it's probably got some element of mulch below it and is probably every once in a while receives some sort of irrigation, for the most part, the degradation of soil at this location leads to drier conditions so that the plant itself is still drying out or losing its vigor during drier periods of the year. You can see it the same way with some of the pine trees that are located around here, and ultimately what we're ending up with are mostly elms, chamisa, and like I mentioned, some of these annual plants that a lot of people refer to as weeds.
Once again, thinking about the 5 healthy soil principles is helpful at this site. In many ways, Frenchy's Field Park is an example of what has gone wrong for so much of our watershed soils, especially in the last 50 to 100 years. But it's also a place where we can think about what to do next. It's more important than ever to keep soil covered here. The degraded soil is not as fertile or hydrated, so it cannot support much living vegetative cover. Using hardy plants and mulch will help hold in more water and invite other plants to colonize. In the past, overgrazing and plowing began to compact the soil, and erosion caused by development and impervious surfaces has led to massive soil loss. Now it's important to stabilize the soil by minimizing these disturbances and allowing soil structure to reform. Even though this landscape shows the degradation that occurs when livestock are mismanaged on our fragile soils, integrating domestic animals can still be a great way to help circulate nutrients in soil and stimulate plant growth. We strongly recommend consulting regenerative grazing experts for the best site-specific guidance. Integrating domestic and wild animals is also helpful in order to maximize biodiversity. For example, pollinators help bushes and forbs reproduce, while prairie dogs help improve water storage and create habitat for other animals such as snakes, lizards, and even birds. As the soil becomes more hydrated, it's easier to maintain a living root. If there is not enough soil moisture or fertility for native perennial plants to survive, non-native annuals are often first to colonize. This can at least provide some habitat and soil cover for natives to reestablish later, though. Finally, it's vital to protect, consider, and incorporate local land management traditions that are rooted in deep, holistic knowledge of these landscapes. so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the rest of our series. See you around the watershed.